Yes.
How the country relates to global trade.
Yes.
And Brazil is not doing well in that.
Yeah, this is well known that of all the major countries in the world, the ratio of trade in Brazil as part of the overall economy is the lowest. So that it is far too closed an economy and it's too protectionist. And I think that's something which Brazil has to do. So apart from cutting government spending, where else can the government do something to sort of withdraw a bit? I think it's got to do on the protectionist front, that the number of protectionist measures in Brazil are far too large, and if you have to cut back on that. So that's something which I'd say that Brazil is not doing well on that front either.
What else is included in this criteria?
Well, I'd say that you look at the second cities in Brazil, and there I think Brazil is doing okay, which is that in Brazil there are lots of second cities, because I talk about some countries such as France.
You call it the rule of
the second
3
cities.
to 1.
3 to 1. Which is
What is that?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about it that in countries with a population of up to 100 million, a good thumb rule that I've developed is if you go to that country, the population of the largest city in that country should typically not be much more than 3 times larger than the second largest city. Because otherwise it tells you too much wealth and too much power is being concentrated in the largest city. So take the case of France. In the case of France, the population of Paris is 6 times larger than the population of the second largest city. And that tells you that there's something wrong. There's too much concentration of power in Paris. Colombia has done well. As you know, there are apart from Bogota, there are other cities in Colombia where the population is quite large and comparable to Bogota, like Medellin. But in Santiago and Chile, that's a real problem.
And Colombia has a lot of new trade agreements with different countries. A lot. And Brazil is still stuck with its Mercosur. What do you think of Mercosur?
No, I think that like it's with the wrong countries also. So it's not just. I'd say that it's about having many more trade agreements. So Colombia, I think, in Latin America has shown the way, and we all know how much Mexico benefited from NAFTA. But I'd say that about Colombia is the one which has made the maximum progress in having more trade agreements in the region.
So the countries that you say that are not the right countries for Brazil are all on the Atlantic, right?
Yeah.
And you say that of the 50 biggest ports in the world, there's just one in our South American Atlantic coast, which is Santos, right? That shows that there's not much
trade going on. Exactly. So Brazil is a relatively closed economy, and if you look at all the success stories of the last 50 years, they've happened in economies which are relatively open. Like China trades so much; it's the world's largest exporter. Before that, Korea, Taiwan, even Japan in the 1960s and 70s.
Vietnam now.
Yeah, now, like as China is losing market share in Asia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, these countries are picking it up.
The next one is inflation high or low? Again?
Yeah, because if you look at most successful economies in the world, and this is a bit counterintuitive, that we tend to think if an economy is growing rapidly, inflation will rise. That's not true. If you look at economies which have enjoyed a long spell of high growth, these economies have persistently had low inflation. The case of China. In China's case, the inflation rate over the last 20 to 30 years has typically been much lower than other emerging markets because China invests so much. So it's sort of related to the other point about investment. When you invest a lot, the inflation rate remains low. In Brazil's case, whenever economic growth picks up even a bit, inflation flares up. And of course, because of too little investment. So you have too many supply bottlenecks in the Brazilian economy that inflation picks up even with little growth that comes up in Brazil. And that's what stymies Brazil's growth.
But could we go back to the needed rate of growth without that inflation? Of
course. I'm saying that all successful economies have done that. So even Brazil's case, for a while last decade, Brazil was doing that. That economic growth had picked up to 4 or 5%, and at least in the middle of the last decade, the inflation rate was still under control. But because so much excess spending has gone and so little investment in the last few years, that now that is no longer possible. So that needs to be rectified over time.